We want to extend special welcome to Council of Foundation members. We're offering this webinar in partnership with the Council. We also want to welcome the Foundation Center users who may be attending because of our guest speaker, Brad Smith. And of course, we're always happy to have our GuideStar users attending as well. Before I hand the event over to the speakers, I do want to go over or reiterate a couple of the housekeeping issues. So next slide, please. We are recording today's event, so don't worry if you miss something. About 48 hours after today, we will send you an email that links to the recording and also to the slides, and we'll also post those two links on our webinar archives page. Next slide, please. And we will be taking questions, as was mentioned, at the end of the webinar. And to submit questions, use the Q&A box. Next slide, please, which may show up at the bottom right of your screen, or next slide. If you don't see it, then there is the little Q&A box at the top of your screen. Or if you're on a Mac, next slide, please, it could show up with that little question mark at the bottom. Next slide, please. We'll also be tweeting today, and if you would like to join us in tweeting about the webinar, you can use the hashtag #DataStandards. And next slide, please. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Jacob Harold and Brad Smith. Jacob is GuideStar's president and CEO. He joined GuideStar in 2012. He came from the Hewlett Foundation, where he led grant making for the Philanthropy program for 6 years. And during that time, he oversaw $30 million in grants that together aim to build a 21st century infrastructure for smart giving. At the beginning of his career, Jacob worked as a climate change campaigner for Rainforest Action Network and Greenpeace USA, and as an organizing director at Citizen Works. He also has worked as a consultant to nonprofits and foundations at the Bridgespan Group, and as a climate change strategist for the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, based at the Energy and Resources Institute in New Delhi, India. And keep that international or global connection in mind as I introduce Brad Smith. Brad Smith is the president of the Foundation Center, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is the leading source of information about philanthropy worldwide. It maintains the most comprehensive database on U.S. and increasingly global grant makers. Before joining the Foundation Center in 2008, Brad Smith was president of the Oak Foundation in Geneva, Switzerland. And that's a major family foundation with program and grant activities in 41 countries in North America, Europe, Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. With the Ford Foundation, he worked as a representative in Brazil before being promoted to vice president in the New York headquarters. And he was responsible there for the Global Peace and Social Justice Program. And before joining the Ford Foundation, he directed the Brazil program of the Inter-American Foundation. And at the start of his career, he worked for the YMCA of the USA, both in Costa Rica and New York. So without further ado, I would like to introduce or hand off to our very well-traveled speakers, Jacob Harold and Brad Smith.
Terrific. Thank you, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. We are very, very thankful that you joined us today to talk about data standards. And I want to just start by saying, you know, data standards may sound like an abstract topic. It may sound somewhat technical, but my hunch is that those of you who've joined us today have joined because you understand that it's actually quite fundamental to social change in the 21st century. That as we think about how to tackle the great challenges of our time, we have to do so with good information. And good information requires the flow of data, and efficient flow of data requires data standards, and today we'll be talking about how that plays out. And we're talking about very significant scale here. I'm just putting up right now an image that some data scientists made based on an analysis of 100 trillion, with a T, calculations about the language that nonprofits use on their websites to describe their own work. And this attempts to create what we would call an emergent taxonomy based not on an arbitrary decision someone makes, but on the words that nonprofits use to describe how they're trying to do good in the world. So we have, on the one hand, we've got this earth that we're all trying to take care of and the people on it. And then on the other hand, we have these very, very complex systems that are our attempts to try and make sense of how we can do good in the world. Whether we're a nonprofit leader trying to find a partner organization or benchmark ourselves against colleague organizations, or a funder trying to find the highest performing organizations, or a journalist or researcher trying to understand an organization or a field. So as we hurtle into the 21st century, it's become increasingly clear that we need to be really smart about how we organize our data. So we're going to talk today about several new initiatives within philanthropy and the broader nonprofit community that are helping us organize information in increasingly efficient and effective ways that we believe can help us all be far better at our jobs. So let's start and just talk about human knowledge and how it's been organized in the past, and just take a moment to think about libraries. And I have some images here of some particularly beautiful libraries, but beautiful or not, all libraries have to have some kind of a system that they use to organize the knowledge that's contained within the books held by that library, so that an individual who comes in search of an answer to a question or a story to be told is able to find that. And most all of us probably remember back in elementary school when we first learned about the Dewey Decimal System as a data standard that helps us organize all this information in a way that's consistent and predictable. And at first glance, when you look at the Dewey Decimal System, there's really a pretty beautiful, clean logic to it. And the Dewey Decimal System has, in many ways, lived up to its initial promise of providing a relatively standardized, stable, intuitive way to navigate through the knowledge that's held within books. But it's also worth pausing and thinking about how every taxonomy is also a product of its time and its place. And if you look at the literature section of the Dewey Decimal System, you see American literature and English literature, German, French, Italian, Spanish, and then there's this category number 890, other literatures, which, it's worth noting, includes all of the literatures of the world except for Europe and the US. That the Dewey Decimal System has embedded within it, encoded within it, the biases of the time and place of its creation. And so it's a reminder that these systems are very powerful, they're very useful, but that we want to be as thoughtful as possible as we think about how do we design the systems that are going to organize information, because there are implications that go far beyond just how quickly can you find a book, but to how do we value different kinds of information? What sorts of questions do we think are important? What sorts of answers do we expect? So this is not just an academic discussion, it has profound implications for how we do the work of social change. And as we think about the world that we are in, many people have described it as a VUCA world. This is a term that comes from military strategy, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And in that sort of a context, the ability to have access to the right information at the right moment becomes especially important as we try to act in a way that's defined by vision, by understanding, by clarity, and by agility. And we have all seen and we all know that data has become a torrent through our lives with immense scale. And that, on the one hand, makes it easier for us to navigate the VUCA world because we're able to get access to good information. But on the other hand, it can make it harder because we can often feel quite overwhelmed by the amount of information that's already available. And we are on a curve that is increasingly steep. And of the stats I have up right now, the one that I find most striking is the one about YouTube, that we think about every minute that 72 hours of new video is uploaded, and just how that multiplies upon itself over time. But as we think about how we as a nonprofit community are going to work together, we're going to have to begin to think much more seriously about how we share information in systematic ways. And that becomes not just a nice to have, but a must have in a world where there is so much information that's flowing. And there are so many questions that we want to answer about the world around us. I like to think that there are 4 basic categories for the information that people might seek when trying to make a decision in the nonprofit sector or in philanthropy. One category is information about the issue itself, the social problem or opportunity which an organization is trying to address. A second category is an intervention, what you might actually do to address that problem or that opportunity. A third category is information about the organizations that are doing that intervention to address that issue. And a fourth category is about resources that go to those organizations to do the intervention to address the issue. And in very broad terms, the government often has the best issue-level data. Academics and researchers often have the best analysis of individual interventions. Within the context of the U.S., GuideStar has the best organizational data, and especially when it comes to grants data, Foundation Center has the best resources data. And one of our challenges going forward is to bring these different types of data together to help us answer more complex questions. I'll give a very brief example from my experience at the Hewlett Foundation. The Hewlett Foundation made investments around teen pregnancy and preventing unwanted teen pregnancy through counseling and other strategies. And the Foundation's board had initially indicated that they wanted a local program based in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the Hewlett Foundation was headquartered. But one of my colleagues put together 2 maps. One map was a map of per capita spending by foundations on teen pregnancy by county in the state of California. And another one was of teen pregnancy rates by county in the state of California. And it turns out those maps told very different stories. The money in California is concentrated in the San Francisco Bay Area and in LA, and that's where there was the highest spending on teen pregnancy. But teen pregnancy rates were highest in the Central Valley of California, where there wasn't as much money. And when the board of the Hewlett Foundation saw those 2 maps, they fundamentally reassessed how they allocated funding and shifted a significant amount of it to the Central Valley of California. That's an example of cross-referencing just 2 of these different categories about information: issue-level information about teen pregnancy rates and resource information about philanthropic investments to address teen pregnancy. As a field, we're going to need to continue to think across these categories to bring them together if we're really going to be smart about making the world better. So given all this complexity, how have we as a field organized most of our information? And the truth is we have used this tax form, or technically this regulatory document, the Form 990, that nonprofits and foundations file with the IRS. And the Form 990 is an immensely powerful tool, but as this particularly egregious example reminds us, it has its own challenges as well. Now, we as a field should be very thankful that the 990 offers us baseline comprehensive data, but we also should be very cognizant that that does not tell the full story of social change, and indeed, we have seen the negative consequences of organizing, of allowing a IRS document to organize the stories that we tell about ourselves in the nonprofit sector. One of the most dire consequences being the overhead myth, the idea that nonprofit performance may be judged solely by accounting ratios as opposed to by the results actually created by nonprofit organizations. So as a field, we have an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that we have to grasp quite aggressively if we're going to move beyond a story about social change that's defined solely by the data available in the Form 990. And as we continue to expand the kind of data that's available and the ways that it can be useful, there's immense value that we as a field can create to help the highest performing organizations raise more money, to build increasing trust in nonprofits, to enable new kinds of collaboration, and to help organizations learn from each other. For GuideStar, what that has meant is an attempt on our part to build a supply chain of information about nonprofits, to take data about nonprofits from those sources on the left of this slide here, whether nonprofits themselves or their many constituents, and get them to those on the right-hand side who have questions about nonprofits that they want to answer. I'll point out a couple of things just very briefly here that I think relate to this broader conversation about data standards. So on the left-hand side, that top line from nonprofits to the IRS is the line for the Form 990. But there's another really important line, which is from nonprofits directly to GuideStar, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, and the ability that nonprofits have to share data directly through GuideStar. The other piece is on the right-hand side, and I like to tell a story of having brunch with a friend of mine who worked at Google, and I told him that we at GuideStar had 7 million users every year. I was very proud of that number, until my friend paused and smiled and said, well, we have 7 million users every minute. And that was a reminder for us that we can be very proud of our accomplishments, but we also have to be humble in the face of the sheer scale of the information technology revolution, and that having a website only gets you so far, and that we have to be thoughtful about how data gets distributed through other kinds of channels. But to do that well, that data has to be standardized, because otherwise you run the risk of immense confusion and inefficiency. And that's why at GuideStar, we've really started to think about standardizing the questions that we ask on the GuideStar profile in a very structured format to ensure that it's predictable and that it makes sense to people, and that it's easy for another platform to bring in that data and display it in a way that makes sense to them. Now, this list of fields, questions that we ask nonprofits, which more than 100,000 nonprofits have shared at least some data with us directly, is right now simply a list of fields. But a question that we are facing right now is, can this become a data standard? Can this become a more familiar object that people are used to interacting with, and that shows up not just on GuideStar.org, but throughout the field? And I think there's good reason to think that the answer is yes. And I'm going to hand it over to Brad now to talk about a number of examples that he and some of our colleagues have worked on where there are already data standards that are successfully helping to organize information across philanthropy in ways that I think are ultimately going to be very powerful for the social good. Brad.
Okay, well, Jacob showed you that particularly egregious, I think was the term he used, example of the 990 filled out in pen or pencil and scribbled all over. I want to take you to a close cousin of the 990, the 990PF. The 990PF is the tax form filled out by private foundations and filed with the Internal Revenue Service. And up until, well, still today, but about to change, that document has been public information, but made public in a extremely unfriendly format. Actually, a lot of people don't understand this, but even if you file your 990 tax return online in digital form, the Internal Revenue Service makes it available to the Foundation Center and to GuideStar and to other people that request it, because it is public information, as an image file called a TIFF. So what this means is essentially the IRS takes a picture of a document that was born digital, transfers it to a CD-ROM, and then makes it available for people. When you're ingesting TIFF files, you need to convert them into some format that can be consumed and entered into a database. So in our case, we turn those TIFF files into searchable PDFs. We optically scan the parts of them that can be scanned, and then we manually key in information from those into a database. And actually, through an agreement that was signed a few years ago, the Foundation Center and GuideStar actually joint outsource the extraction of data from these documents. So what can you do when you extract that information and put it into databases? Well, the first thing you can begin to do is to organize it and classify it. And Jacob was talking about data standards and about taxonomies. And Jacob and I are, part of a small select group of people on the planet whose pulse actually quickens at the mention of the word taxonomy. What you're looking at here is a subject taxonomy that is used by the Foundation Center. The Foundation Center classifies foundation grants according to the subject of the grant, the population that benefits, the type of transaction, whether it's a cash grant or a loan, and the approach used by the funder, whether it's capacity building, general support, or capital improvement, for example. This is a high-level look at the subject taxonomy. If we clicked on any one of these bubbles, it would break into lower categories. So for social sciences, you see subcategories, and some of these go about 4 deep. There's about 1,300 terms in this taxonomy. It was developed quite some time ago and then revised 2 years ago through a process involving 200 organizations around the world and a public comment period. So once you've organized information and tagged it and classified it this way using these kinds of standards, you can begin to answer what we like to think of as the 2 primordial questions facing philanthropy. The first is who's funding what where. Philanthropy, because of the nature of the institutions, endowed institutions, is filled with organizations that make individual decisions, often in isolation from each other. So there's a lot of duplication, people funding the same thing and not really knowing what each other are funding because it's not that easy to find out. So once you've classified this information, you can begin to do things like this. And if you go to a URL called disasterphilanthropy.foundationcenter.org, you can explore this site. This was actually developed by the Foundation Center for an organization called the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Most foundations will tell you that they do not fund disasters until there's a disaster. Then, moved by the news, by compassion, by good human values, foundations want to help, and they start making grants. That grant making could be a lot more efficient if we knew much more about how those dollars are being spent. So what this site will enable you to do is actually explore different types of disasters, whether they're man-made, natural disasters, or complex humanitarian emergencies, see how the grants have been made, where they're going in the world, how they compare with government spending flows, and what kinds of approaches are used, how much is going for preparedness or resilience versus how much is going for response and relief. A second kind of question, just to give an example, is we're in election season in the United States. I think most of you probably noticed. This is a website that was actually commissioned by a group of foundations led by the Hewlett Foundation, including others, including the Democracy Fund, the Rita Allen Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and Rockefeller Brothers. And what it does is it shows the landscape of U.S. foundation funding that is actually focused on trying to make American democracy function better. So this is not really grant making about services. This is actually about our democratic systems. So you can get into this data, and the URL for this is democracy.foundationcenter.org. And you can explore, for example, how much philanthropic spending is going for campaign finance reform and exactly what it's going for. And you'll also see that there's a diversity of approaches from foundations. There's foundations that take a more libertarian approach to these issues, and others that take sort of what some people would see as a more progressive approach. But again, these are questions that can be answered because we have data standards. So Jacob and I had two data asks for all foundations. The first is to use the Foundation Center's reporting protocol. What we mean by that is, on the slide I showed you a few slides back of the 990 tax returns, there was a little symbol that said e-reporter on it. About 1,400 foundations in the U.S. electronically report their grants information to the Foundation Center, exporting it directly from their grants management systems to us. So if you use that protocol, and you can send your grants directly to us, you control the information, they get into databases much faster, and they can help us answer questions much faster. The second is to collect applicant data through the GuideStar profile. Jacob talked about this, but this is really to reduce the burden on applicants and give your staff better data. Nonprofits who apply to foundations often have to repeat the same information many different ways for many different foundation application procedures. And this is a process that basically allows this information to be deposited in a central repository, then uploaded into those application processes. I also just wanted to talk a little bit about another kind of ask for the social sector, and this relates to unique digital identifiers. What you're looking at is a VIN number of a car. I think you're all familiar with that. This is the digital code which identifies your particular Prius as being a unique vehicle. The equivalent of this in the nonprofit sector has emerged through a joint effort by GuideStar, the Foundation Center, TechSoup Global, and Global Giving. And that is the Bridge ID system, the basic registry of identified global entities. There's also a web URL for this. It's bridge-registry.org. And this is just the beginnings of the creation of a universal digital ID system for all nonprofits in the world, which will allow databases to identify a given nonprofit as having a specific, unique identity. And what this does is it facilitates enormously the exchange of information about organizations through databases and data platforms, and a whole series of metrics to be built on top of it. The other question that we can answer with this kind of information is, how can I know what others know? Our sector, because organizations are isolated, often work on issues without the benefit of knowing what other organizations have already learned about working on that issue. A platform called Issuelab, this is a service of Foundation Center, is basically an open digital archive of close to 20,000 pieces of research that have been funded by foundations or produced by nonprofits that form a body of social sector knowledge about a vast array of issues around the world. This is a digital open archive, meaning that all the metadata on it, the abstracts and the tagging, can actually be consumed automatically by computers. So anything that goes into this automatically goes into WorldCat, the worldwide network of 10,000 libraries, and circulates around the world. And this is the second digital ID that I want to bring you to, is that because the way Issuelab is connected to a distributed universe of knowledge dissemination through websites, through libraries, through the platform itself, the objects in it, and an object in this case is a piece of research, it's a HTML document, a research report, can be given a digital object identifier, which identifies it as a unique piece of research, unique publication on the internet, and travels with that document as it courses through the internet. Allows it to be permanently found even if the link is taken down from the originating website. And because it is unique and it's digital, just like a VIN number or a bridge number, there's a metrics industry being built on top of this that can begin to tell us, for example, for a piece of research or a publication of our own organizations, what the impact has been. How many times it's been tweeted, how many times it's been blogged, what Facebook pages it's on, how many times it's been cited, how many times it's been mentioned. And this is a thing we've all been looking for, is to know how does our knowledge circulate in the world and what kind of impact. And a digital object identifier can help us get there. So the two additional asks that we have for all social sector organizations is use bridge IDs. Now some of you may be saying, well, why do we need bridge IDs in the US? We have tax ID numbers, right? EIN numbers. Well, it actually turns out that EIN numbers are reused like phone numbers, so they're not 100% accurate. But if we think globally, many, many countries do not have the equivalent of an EIN number. So this unique digital identifier is potentially a core building block for a reliable knowledge system about our field. And then digital object identifiers for your reports, research, and evaluations to understand how they travel through the internet. Jacob?
Great, thank you, Brad. So the dream here is that as we begin and really continue to establish these different types of data standards for different elements of social change, whether it's a bridge ID for identifying organizations or a digital object identifier for identifying documents or publications, the GuideStar profile for describing nonprofits in a consistent way, e-reporting protocol to ensure the efficient sharing of data about foundation grants, that all of these help to lead us to a world where there's much more fluid flow of information, and not for its own sake, but so that we, in social change, can make better decisions, and thus so that we can make a better world. And one thing I will ask all of you who have taken time out of your day to talk about nonprofit data standards is to help us share this. Our hunch is that most of the folks who've joined this particular conversation are people who understand why data matters and why data matters to social change. And so help us tell this story and help us drive adoption of these different types of data standards so that a handful of us can spend a lot of time thinking about data standards, but that the rest of us, the rest of the field, can really be focused on the work at hand and focused on serving the people and the communities and the ecosystems that are served by nonprofits and by foundations. So before we go to the Q&A, I will end with a poem. When one is speaking of such sometimes technical matters, I think it is good to return to poetry. And here to quote Alexander Pope, who did not realize that he was talking about data standards 3 centuries ago, but in a way he was. So here goes. Not chaos-like together crushed and bruised, but as the world harmoniously confused, where order in variety we see, and where, though all things differ, all agree. And we believe that data standards can help us find order in that variety while still respecting that variety. So thank you all, and with that, I will turn it back to Suzanne to help us sort through all the questions that we've been getting.
Well, okay, and one question is for Brad, and it's, can only 501c3 organizations contribute to the Issuelab?
The majority of the reports in Issuelab come from nonprofits, although some of them come from public entities, from government departments and government bureaus, for example. I don't believe there's any private sector reports in there. It would depend a lot on the subject matter. I could imagine some corporate social responsibility kind of information being in there. This is really about social issues, and it was created to fill a niche that was not being covered by other kinds of archives, largely government archives and academic archives.
Okay. And then you both have made specific suggestions for what our listeners can do, but as they try to spread the word, what do you recommend the messaging to their constituents should be, or how they should spread the word, approach spreading the word?
You know, it's a good question, and this is actually something that I, on a personal level, have wrestled with, which is that different people hear this argument in different ways. If you are the CTO of a foundation, there probably are some on the call today, you may be able to do some of this without even telling anyone. And simply because you just make it a part of the core processes of your foundation. And to a certain extent that's helpful, but it doesn't necessarily help to explain to people why this matters and why it helps us all do our jobs better. So I'll mention a couple of things. So one is we just have to offer concrete examples where possible of how having access to the right information helps us make good decisions, like the story I told about teen pregnancy in California. And then also recognize that some people come to understand data standards through metaphors. One metaphor that I really like to use is of a shipping container. And you all have seen shipping containers stacked on giant container ships or on a train or a truck. And they've completely transformed world trade because they are standardized. And you put all sorts of different things inside of them, but the fact that they're the same size and shape helps to make the entire system more efficient. Another kind of data standard is a nutrition label. And nutrition labels are a standardized way of presenting information that people become familiar with, and that creates all sorts of efficiencies when people are trying to make decisions about packaged food. And so, I would recommend A, use a concrete example of how this can be helpful. And then B, if it's not sticking, try a metaphor that helps people understand how in other parts of life and society and the economy, data standards have been really, really important for helping us grow and improve and learn and get better.
Okay. Another question that came up was looking at challenges to creating or using data standards in the United States versus doing that globally. Is it more or less challenging, or is there a difference in the type of challenges that we face when we're trying to create these standards?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I honestly think, though, that the biggest challenges that come from in our sector, the Foundation Center increasingly uses the concept of social sector to sort of cover an array of organizational forms that are trying to do social good. But what a lot of those organizations have in common is that they're not subject to market forces the same way that private corporations are, for example, profit-making corporations. They're not getting votes like politicians are. They are raising money, but they don't have some of the same kind of incentives and pressures that lead to standardization, like Jacob was talking about of containers, for example, shipping containers around the world. There really isn't an easy nonprofit equivalent to containers. So that's sort of a global challenge. I think the specific challenges you have in some countries, it's actually easier. In the Netherlands, for example, if you are going to create a foundation in the Netherlands, you, by law, have to have a website. In the US, you don't. And 93% of American foundations do not have websites. So there's an example where it's easier to get information on foundations in the Netherlands than it is in the US. Reporting requirements in China, for example, there are a lot of reporting requirements. Some of those are onerous, but there's a lot of public information. And there's kinds of transparency indexes being created in China that would be difficult to imagine being created here. I think I'd say two of the biggest obstacles that we face in sort of globally are the strength of data and statistical capabilities in many countries. And then there's a real problem which is disappearing over time, but it's bandwidth. Actually, access is still a problem. There's a digital divide. And a lot of the kinds of applications that a lot of us can dream up and visualizations and cool things we all like to build can take forever to download in some parts of the world. And that is an obstacle to use. And one of the things that I've learned in working with this data is if you cannot build a use case for the data that allows people to see how it will benefit their work, the talk about data standards often falls on deaf ears.
I would very much agree with that. And I'll add, as we think about global expansion, that I do think there are an opportunity for extraordinary efficiencies, for lessons that have been learned in one country to be effectively shared with another, and hopefully for other countries to avoid mistakes that, for example, we may have made here in the U.S. But to do that well, we also have to acknowledge the diversity of the different forms of social sector organizations around the world, and wrestle with some hard questions about what do they all have in common. Devotion to public good, perhaps, but there might be slightly different legal contexts that they're operating within, and there are implications there. But those are really powerful and important questions to have, and that's a place where talking about data standards forces us to better understand what it is that we share and in what ways we differ. And I think those are very, very useful conversations for us to have, and the data standards help us move on over time to more and more interesting and ultimately important conversation.
Thank you. Your comments just stimulated a whole mess of questions, so I'm going through them. One is, are there recommendations and best practices you can share regarding data standards for outcome collection and reporting?
So this is a very present question for GuideStar. So thank you to whoever asked that. This has been a question that the field has wrestled with for a long time, that because of the comparability of financial data, we have long had a lot more data about organizational finances than we have about organizational results, when I think we all agree that it's results that matter. But there's a good reason for that, which is that nonprofits are immensely diverse, and they measure different things because they have different missions and different strategies. So yesterday, GuideStar launched the highest level of the GuideStar profile, which is called GuideStar Platinum, which is the first ever field level collection tool for collecting quantitative data about how nonprofits are doing against their mission. Now, when I say programmatic, that means both outcomes and outputs, and I'll explain what I mean by the difference there. That if you think about a job training program, for example, that the number of people who complete your training might be an output. That is a measure of the work that you have done. But the number of people who complete your training who then get a job and keep it for, say, a year, that's an outcome. That's an actual social result that comes from your work. It tends to be easier to measure outputs than outcomes. You don't have to track people down a year after the training to find out if they kept the job. But it is outcomes that ultimately matter. We at GuideStar believe that. We believe that outcomes are what matter, but we also fully recognize the difficulty of measuring certain types of social change. And so we are welcoming both output and outcome data in the platinum level of the GuideStar profile. And we have some very, very promising signs. We had 500 nonprofits sign up within 48 hours of our pilot phase, and expect to have thousands and thousands of nonprofits completing the platinum level of the profile by the end of this year, which will give us a baseline of data to help us better understand how much are nonprofits measuring outputs versus outcomes. How does that vary by issue area or geography or organizational size? So I would expect over the next couple of years that that data will help us as a field better understand how nonprofits measure their own performance, and then hopefully to provide better tools and support to help nonprofits do even better.
Good. And then another question that has come in is, are you working with any grant management technology vendors to help drive the design and ultimately incorporate the standards into their software platforms?
Yeah, the answer is, we're both nodding our heads. The answer is yes. There's a variety of grants management software providers. The Foundation Center for a number of years has worked with 12 or 13 of them actually to make it possible to export grants data directly from the Grants Management Foundation grants management systems to the Foundation Center to be incorporated in the databases, so we'd have to wait for them through the 990 PF process. There's also been a newer generation of work actually incorporating the taxonomies I showed you, some special taxonomies, for example, around the democracy project I showed you, and also the reverse, basically incorporating Foundation Center data and, for example, mapping applications within a grants management software program. So someone, for example, is looking up an organization, and this goes for GuideStar as well. There's a number of vendors, for example, that a program officer may be processing a grant to an organization, and without logging out of their grants management system and logging into a separate Foundation Center or GuideStar database, can basically access that information without leaving their system, finding out whether the 501c3 status is current, getting basic information about that grantee, and then seeing what other foundations might have made grants to it. The one thing I think is tricky about the grants management software business is that it attends a relative, Jacob was talking about the number of Google users that visit per minute or something, or some astronomical number. The grants management software market is actually quite small. There's about 87,000 private foundations in the U.S. Fewer than 1,000 of them have over $100 million in assets, and 3/4 of them have 4 staff or less. So we're talking about a lot of very small institutions with pretty low technology needs and a smaller number of very large sophisticated organizations. So that's kind of a narrow market for developing cutting-edge software.
That's right, and that's where I think there's a real opportunity for division of labor here, that if those vendors are able to focus on building the software itself and focusing on that user experience, they can trust that Foundation Center can provide a taxonomy that makes sense, or provide a distribution system for data about grants, just as they can trust that GuideStar can be an input into the application process, auto-populating proposals with the data that we already have. And many of the key players in the grants management software field have signed deals to use GuideStar's data to just cut out an entire step for applicants. Because once an organization puts in its name, then it will automatically call from the GuideStar database and auto-populate that proposal with data that we have. And that's a kind of a beachhead, we think, so that over time we can add more and more data, more and more richness to those applications, all the while removing waste and duplication on the part of the applicants themselves.
And we've got about 2 more questions. One is about the digital divide. You just mentioned organizations like the smaller grant makers who don't have high technology needs, and on the other side you have the grantees or the nonprofits that are terribly technical or don't have a lot of technology in their day-to-day work. How can they be helped to address data standards and adopt data standards?
So there's going to be a natural continuum that a multi-billion-dollar foundation with its own tech team may engage with the data standards question in a more sophisticated way, and that's fine. But we at GuideStar and Foundation Center and our colleague organizations, we feel we have a responsibility and an opportunity to offer tools that are as easy to use as possible for even the smallest of nonprofits or of foundations. And that, for example, that some of GuideStar's tools, like our financial scan tool, for example, can help a very, very small foundation do relatively sophisticated analysis of applicant finances. Or that the kind of deals that we've talked about with the grants management software vendors can make it much easier to gather information if you're a small foundation. And maybe giving out smaller grants, so you don't want to have as much of a burden on your applicants. So to a certain extent, we hope that data standards help to lead to more and more innovation that provides more and more power and functionality to even the smallest players.
And I also think, as technology gets better and better, a lot of what people used to have to build in-house is available through applications. I mean, if we just stop and think about the way we run our daily lives and what we do on our cell phones, we don't have a team, an IT team with us when we're using our cell phones, but we're looking at maps, we're looking at restaurants, we're planning trips, we're shopping, we're doing all sorts of things through enormously powerful but very simple and easy and intuitive interfaces. And I think these developments are coming to our sector. The other thing that will happen is I think a lot of the data standards will actually be in some ways supplied externally. For example, a digital object identifier, that is something that you can obtain for free. All you basically, in the case if you go to Issuelab, you can get a digital object identifier for free. GuideStar, TechSoup Global, the Foundation Center, and Global Giving are assigning bridge IDs to all the entities in their databases. And actually, the test when we were building it was to dedupe all our databases to figure out between us how many unique organizations we had, because we had all identified them in our own way. And just as this webinar was going on, I got an email with a press release from Australia saying, commenting with government regulators there when they saw that bridge IDs were being assigned to Australian nonprofits that are in the databases of some of our participating organizations and how revolutionary this was going to be for the sector. So a lot of these things will sort of happen by the fact that we're part of a sector. I mean, this is why we're a sector, and this is why we have infrastructure, precisely to be able to do these things at scale.
And then our last question is sort of a two-parter. You referred to the overhead myth, and can you talk more about how data standards can provide alternatives to the overhead myth? And then the second part of that question is, you referred to high-performing nonprofits. Who determines which organizations are high-performing?
So with the overhead myth was born out of an entirely reasonable desire on the part of donors to make decisions based on data. They wanted to spend their money responsibly. The only data they were able to find that was comparable were these financial ratios. And then through a series of unfortunate events, I would argue, we've managed to reinforce that those overhead ratios are a proxy for performance. So if we want to get out of that situation, we have a responsibility as a field to offer donors an alternative, to offer them something that's more meaningful than a financial ratio when actually trying to describe the effectiveness of a nonprofit. And to do that, we have to collect a variety of different kinds of information that reflects the diversity of the world and then present that in a standardized way. And that is the definition of data standards. That is what this is all about. And data standards are critical as we think about collecting enough data that is sufficiently comparable to present to donors something that will feel better than the overhead ratios, and that will allow them to feel that they're making an informed decision in a way that makes sense to them, but that's based on something more meaningful. Now this gets onto the second part of the question, which is, who decides what high performance is? And the truth is that different people will have different preferences there. Some people will have preferences according to issue area and might say, well, if you're not working on climate change, which is the greatest issue of our time, then you're not high performing. Others might say the same thing about education or health or the arts. And those are ethical decisions that we have to make as people. Then other people might care about the short term versus the long term. Some might say, I really want to see results immediately. And other donors or decision makers, analysts might say, we're willing to wait. Others might want low risk versus high risk. I want to know for sure what's going to happen with my dollars, or I'm willing to have some uncertainty about what the results are going to be because I think this risk might be worth it. So we're all going to bring different frameworks to these discussions, and we believe that with the right data, you can address people's different desires, their own different definitions of high performance in different ways. And so that's to say it's a harder question, but I still think it's a solvable one. It's one that doesn't have a single answer, but that doesn't mean that we as a field don't have a responsibility to do our very best, whatever someone's definition of high performance may be, to try to answer that, to address it.
Yeah, I just to add just real quickly that I think both GuideStar and the Foundation Center, share a philosophy about not being rating agencies. And we're very convinced that what we need to do is show people the information they need to make the kinds of choices about things like performance according to the criteria that they use. That's very different than coming up with sort of a score or a single one-size-fits-all rating system for something as complex as social and environmental change.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I will wrap things up. Thank you, Jacob and Brad, for your insights, and thank you, everyone, for attending. We covered a lot of information today, so you, as I mentioned before, you will receive an email within 48 hours with links to the recording of this webinar and links to the slides. And if you have additional questions in the meantime, please feel free to ask them in the post-event survey that will pop up when you close out of this presentation. And with that, I will bid everyone good day, and thank you again for attending.